Young people in previous years, so those two reasons. Young people entering the workforce without sufficient skills and inflation. These two reasons are the economic explanation for the income poverty that Venezuela has experienced since the 1970s onwards. These are the fundamental features of the rentier style. That allows me then to the next question. The importance of the role of education in a country is then seen. Not only to move away from a rentier model as we have had until now, but to promote, training, the development of capabilities, now. When is it said that a society falls into a tragedy? Poverty, and Venezuela is in a trap of poverty. There was a sound problem and I didn't hear the last part of your question well. I think you asked me if Venezuela was in a poverty trap. It is said that a society is in a trap of poverty, and if Venezuela is in a poverty trap. We have about 20 minutes, Professor, and I have about 3 or 4 left. Questions to be able to distribute time because all the information. What you are giving is very valuable, and I don't want anything to be left out, no. So what can the trap tell us that it is said that? One says that a society is in a poverty trap when it is no longer generating sufficient capabilities in its members. In children and young people, it is not creating sufficient human capacities. Nor is cooperation being created, that is to say, relational social capital is not being created that allow the capacities of society to be built in turn. As capacity building slows, progress stalls. Economic progress stops or slows down, and therefore, there is beginning to be an increasing composition of poor people in society. That's why it's called a poverty trap, and it's not solved by subsidizing the poor. It is solved by helping those who were unable to develop skills. Because capacity building was neglected, through neglect of education and health. It is resolved by making a much greater and much better focused effort. In capacity building, fundamentally in capacity building. Human through education and health and capacity building. Systemic through cooperation to increase the productive capacity of the economy. It is clearly seen, Professor, clearly listening to his words, that Venezuela is in a crisis. Development style because they have decreased training. The development of capacities in Venezuela is totally diminished. Therefore, it can be deduced that Venezuela is in a trap. Development, and is therefore in a development style crisis. What can you say? Indeed, look at Venezuela. Venezuela and after the price boom. Oil that existed in the years from 1973 to 1970. Or that boom was an explosion of international prices. Of oil that caused huge amounts of resources to enter Venezuela. But after that, when oil prices fell, they came to fall to $9 after having been at $100, and when that happens. I was telling you before that the Venezuelan state has not changed its style. Development did not find another way to nominally cover its. The United States found no other way than to produce more currency and therefore fired chronic inflation. Venezuelan society began to decline, and in 1998 we already had. This can be said that the Venezuelan poverty trap begins from 1978, that it was the high point of the sustained progress that had been made in all areas since 1928. For 50 years, we have made progress in all aspects. Until 1978, from then on, the decline in capacity building began. The rise of the began an inflationary process. Chronic, and Venezuela entered a continuous decline that lasted 20 years until reaching a 1998. That was a poverty trap. The poverty trap manifested itself in a drop in gross domestic product per capita, say income. Per capita Venezuelan real wages. In 1998, the real salary of Venezuelans was something like 10% of what it had been in 1978. Imagine such a fall. Poverty had risen from just 27% to more than 60%. That is, we were really in a poverty trap. In fact, then, excuse me for interrupting you because it makes me think this. According to what you say, the poverty trap has its antecedents before the arrival of the year 2000, when a different government begins. Not from what I see and what started to happen from then on. The year 2000 in Venezuela has its antecedents in the previous 15 years. In the previous 20 years, the previous 20 years, we were already in a poverty trap for the 20 years leading up to 1998. But what happens next is that when they come to power, a group not really interested in the cohesion of Venezuelans, but in polarization, in confrontation between them. He removed a component that is essential to create systemic capabilities, which is the willingness of people to cooperate. Populist leaderships and democracy are threatened throughout the world, not only. Mind in Latin America is threatened by populist leaderships. Populist leaderships seek to generate confrontation within society. Populist leaderships do not succeed when institutions are strong. They are robust, they are resistant, and when a society is in true sustained development. But Venezuela was not. Venezuela was in a poverty trap. The institutions were very weak, and it was possible to fully assume power. It was possible to capture the Venezuelan institutions by a leadership populist than in what we enter from the year 2005. Because the first years are the first years of the last part of the history of the rentier development style, or years of capture of institutions. The first 5 years is dedicated. Let's say political power captures the institutions. Capture the judicial, legislative institutions. Capture education because it was a way to ideologize in, to change the chip of the culture, that the beliefs and the imagination. Exactly, the beliefs, the values of damage. The motivation for cohesion that Venezuelan society could still have. The first 5 years are like this in the first years from 2006 or 2007 onwards and until 2014 is the year in which a price boom occurs again. International oil so that the state can. Venezuelans can once again enjoy resources and in fact slightly improve some things. But not capacity building. On the contrary, educational systems, for example, public educational systems, they become even weaker and also become in a mechanism expressly used to ideologize. So Professor, gosh, we will have little time left to continue with the interview. In case of not being able to continue, another recording will be open to continue. Okay, well then I'm done telling you, forgive me that. In this context, in this very obvious situation, where capabilities have not been developed at this time, how Venezuela can insert itself in the achievement of sustainable development goals. Being very clear that our institutions are totally destroyed and being very clear that we live in a crisis development style and that we are in a poverty trap. What are its contributions? What do you suggest for today's Venezuela and today's professionals? Venezuela is not going to be able to recover from the crisis. Will not be able to recover from the more than 40 years of cheating that he has already had. Poverty trap, unless the development style changes, that is, in Venezuela. Many people are talking today about the political transition that I hope can be achieved. Very soon, we are a week away from what most people indicate is a opportunity to begin a transition to democracy. The transition that Venezuela requires is much more ambitious than a transition to democracy. It is a transition to a new style of development. And we can talk about this if it is running out on an upcoming recording you want to make. Yes, the topic is very extensive, because I would also love, I don't know if in these few minutes, you could say, what would be the main problems that can be addressed at this time to begin the recovery of and start in that new style of development that, of course, this is a long-term projection. But what would be those first steps and what would be the main aspects to address? Look, Venezuela would have to implement strategies in by two major routes. There is a way that is, we must help the population that has been living in absolute precariousness since 2015. That is to say, in Venezuela we are experiencing what is called in humanitarian terms a humanitarian crisis. The real wages of families do not provide for maintain even minimal levels of nutrition for children, and there are already effects that have been identified by nutritionists and sociologists, effects that range to last a long time in what is now Venezuelan childhood. But in addition to that, which is very important, we must dedicate ourselves to institutional reform. The reform of the rules, the disappearance of rentism. I was telling you at the beginning when you asked me what a development style was. A development style is a way of functioning that is highly influenced by institutions. So the first thing to do to change your development style, it is to reform the institutions, and there are a few fundamental institutions to reform. Please let me know, because I probably won't have time to explain to you what we should have few minutes left, and we could open another space to delve deeper into this proposal for the recovery of Venezuela. Now at this point we are going to do a little closing of what we have talked about so far. What recommendation do you give to them, students of the subject research and sustainability, and now that they are aware of the situation we are experiencing as a country and its sustainable development? What words do you give him to close this conversation and we left pending another new recording? Of course, look, first of all, I understand that the students of this subject at UNIMED are educators. Yes, however, they can also be students from other university courses later. They can be students from all majors at the university, in principle educators. So I dedicate this answer to young university students and educators. Okay, education is not a means of training. It is a means of creating human capabilities that are much more than skills to get into the workplace. Human capacities are capacities to exercise freedom. I leave that there for both young people and educators, and therefore the role of the educator in changing the development style is fundamental. It is a very important lever for introduce changes that will take time to implement in the culture. In civic culture. To the young people who will be our leaders of the future, the fundamental role mental that they have in the change of development style is exercising freedom and autonomy from day one, and pressure the state to assume the subsidiary role that corresponds in a democracy, which is a role of facilitating the exercise of freedom and autonomy by citizens. Let's say that those would be what I say to educators and young university students. Thank you very much, Professor, and I take this from this from this recommendation that you give to these university students. I take this phrase. The role of the educator is to create, is to contribute to creating a new style of development. So in the next interview, the focus will be on that. What do you consider to be the strategies for university students can contribute to this new style of development? Venezuela needs. Thank you very much, Professor. See you in the next interview and thank you very much again. Time to contribute to raising the awareness of professionals. Solanos, lots of them. Thank you.